Chapter 33. A blanket of darkness fell over the vast cartel army as Rojas stood tall in the center of this sea of muscle. "Jefe, the sun is down," one of his men said on his right. He turned his head slowly to look at him, his lip curling in disgust. "Aren't we—" He coughed as fear took his voice. He then cleared his throat and finished his thought. "Aren't we supposed to go in now?" Rojas sighed and rolled his eye at the man. Normally, such insolence would drive his rage into a frenzied storm. But he was feeling generous today. Well, perhaps it wasn't generosity that stayed his hand. It was necessity. Sure, his men outnumbered Shields and whatever resistance he had mustered. But the old man was crafty, and while Julio still felt that victory was assured, he placed value in every single soldier under his command, for the first time ever. Each of these men now was worth their weight in gold, and he would see to it that every single one of them made it to that gate. "We wait," Julio simply said to the man. "Let your enemies sweat it out, give them hope, and then take it away from them." "Wow," the man said, considering Julio's words. "That's brilliant, Jefe." Julio simply grunted in response. He was well aware of the tactical brilliance of such a maneuver, but he couldn't take credit for it. This was something he'd learned long ago from his uncle, from the man he'd had to say goodbye to far too early because of Sam Shields and his vile offspring. But today, all of that was going to change. He knew Shields and the boy would be waiting for him on the farm, even if everyone had abandoned the property in the face of his threat. Those two would be there. There was no way Shields and his precious morals would allow the cartel to go on a murderous rampage through the surrounding area, all in the name of finding him. He also figured that, despite his ominous threat and promise of hell, some of the people who lived within the walls of that farm would stay out of some ridiculous devotion to this horrible man and his wretched family. That was fine. Julio was prepared for that. In fact, he was looking forward to it. He would set an example, showing the entire world what happened to those who turned their noses up at his mercy. The prisoner, Jacob, had told him that the people who dwelled on the farm felt an extreme level of gratitude and devotion to Shields. But he was looking forward to seeing exactly how far that went when faced with a threat like this. He spent the next 30 minutes imagining what he was going to find within the walls of that farm. Would it be empty? Would it be packed to the brim with screaming farmers, all willing to fall on their swords for this man and his son? Would they set fire to the land, ensuring the cartel would not be able to sustain its own community once they took the property? He imagined the moment that he came face to face with Shields once more. This made him think back to their one-on-one fight in that back alley. He'd toyed with him there, and in doing so, he'd nearly allowed his foe to squeak out a victory. But he felt Shields tire, felt him wear down with every exchange. This time, he wouldn't draw out the victory. He'd already had his fun tormenting the old man. This time, he would take him fast. The one he wanted time with was the boy. Julio smiled, the grill that covered his teeth peeking out through his lips, as he imagined the slow, torturous death he was going to inflict on young Eric. He only hoped that a stray bullet didn't claim the lives of either the father or the son before he had a chance to personally enact his revenge on them. The thought of the boy squirming like a fish out of water within the strong and unshakable grip of his menacing fingers proved to be the final push that brought his extensive patience to an end. It was time to move out. It was time to fight. It was time to kill. "For you, Tio," Julio whispered, so softly that even those in his immediate area wouldn't be able to hear it. "Let's go," he screamed. And as one, the cartel army walked forward. Chapter 34. The moon and stars had filled the sky for 40 minutes before movement caught Sam's eye. He saw them coming over the horizon, marching together with weapons drawn, coming ever closer to the wall with every passing step. They were still far now, still beyond the reach of their traps and explosives. "They're here!" Joe yelled loudly enough for the fighters in the trenches to hear it. Eric began to shake beside Sam, and Sam was concerned at first that the young man was starting to lose his nerve. But one look into his son's eyes told a much different story. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. He was itching to dive into the fray, and Sam's nerves settled upon noticing this. "Easy, Eric," he said. While it was good that the boy was showing no fear, he also didn't want him blinding himself with blood, rage, and anticipation. "Breathe. Let them come to us. Keep your head out there." "Yes, sir," Eric said, hissing through his teeth. Sam turned to Joseph. "You ready, big man?" Joe gave him a sidelong glance. "I will follow you, my brother, my captain, my king," he said with a wink, once more quoting Lord of the Rings to the annoyance of his long-standing friend. But Joe had been standing with Sam since the moment the EMP changed the world. He'd been integral to the survival of Sam and his family many times over. He'd earned a little something special. "Let this be the hour when we draw swords together," Sam said, giving his friend a knowing smile. Joe's face lit up at the remark, and he nodded in approval. "Fell deeds awake," Joe said, pumping his fist in excitement. "Now for wrath," Eric said on the other side of Sam. He looked over at his son with his eyebrows raised, having never realized Eric had committed any of these obscure quotes to memory. "Now for ruin. And the Red Dawn," Sam muttered, as the cartel charged. They were close enough now that Sam could hear them screaming. They sprinted toward the gate, all full of fury and testosterone, ready to run through this community of simple farmers and bully their way to the strongest foothold they could ever hope for in the region. "Wait for it," Sam said, holding his breath until one more time he said, "Wait for it." "Oh, this is gonna rock," Joe said, with a knowing half-smile. A second later, the first of the landmines was tripped, and the ground beneath one of the soldiers exploded in a vicious fireball that tore the unfortunate cartel fighter apart and threw many of his companions off their feet, missing limbs. The air soon filled with the sounds of dozens of landmines flaring to life, tearing through their enemies left and right, bringing nearly the entire company to a panicked halt as even more of them poured in over the horizon. "Light 'em up," Sam called out, and every man on the wall gripped their mounted machine guns and opened fire. Gunfire ripped out over the battlefield, and with nothing more than a casual, almost lazy turn of the barrel, cartel members fell in bulk. Some of them tried to retreat as the machine guns flared to life, but many of them triggered additional mines that lit up the fields with flames, as though there was a horde of slumbering dragons beneath the ground, who were violently waking at the cartel's approach. "Keep firing," Sam called out, and he noticed Eric lifting his gun and pointing it down at the members of the cartel, both those fleeing and those trying to push ahead. The young man took a deep, focused breath, held it, and pulled the trigger. Sam wasn't sure how many lives were being claimed specifically by Eric's weapon, but he was certain the bullets flying out of his gun were finding a mark in some of the closer cartel soldiers, dropping them in place. "The kid has the right idea," Joe said, opening fire with his own rifle, tearing through the cartel soldiers with practiced precision. The cartel soldiers started to fire back now that they were coming within range. They shot at any exposed head they could find, but the wall provided Sam's sentries with ample protection. The exploding mines and gunfire created a booming, cacophonous symphony of death that played on repeat as man by man, group by group, members of the cartel fell. Their bodies were soon littering the battlefield in such numbers that their fellows had to leap and dodge over and around them. This only slowed their approach and made them easier targets. But despite this momentary advantage, there was one major issue that was not yet resolving itself. They were still coming. More and more of them appeared on the horizon, and the minefield was starting to grow depleted. What was more, they were still firing back, and a few of their shots had managed to find their mark. Sam had watched in horror as 4 of their sentries had taken fire. 3 of them had plummeted off the wall onto the ground below, while the last one was still crumpled atop the wall. Sam had no idea whether they were alive or dead. "Keep pushing," Sam shouted, trying to keep morale up. "Thin the herd. Make them work for every inch." "Hey," Joe shouted, and his response was echoed by many others along the wall. Soon, through the shadows of the night, Sam started to see individual flames sprouting up, but they were far too small to be the booming conflagration of a landmine. These were Molotov cocktails being lit and hurled at the wall. They broke against the wooden surface, catching fire and sending up a hazy screen of smoke that started to choke many of the sentries and block their vantage points. Through the smoke, Sam could see a large shadow approaching. He squinted through the darkness to make out exactly what it was. This was a group of cartel soldiers, all holding a massive tree trunk from both sides. "What the hell?" Eric questioned. But Joe understood right away. "It's a battering ram," he called out in alarm. "Take these fuckers out before they get to the gates." But as they turned their attention to the cartel soldiers running forward with the ram, the others on the ground started to increase their fire and throw more exploding firebombs toward the upper reaches of the wall. A few of them even cleared the top spikes, crashing to the catwalk at their feet and causing it to catch fire. "Shit!" Eric yelled. Sam turned his attention to the flames that erupted to life between him and his son, stomping hard on them to try to douse them. Many other sentries were doing the same on their ends. Joe continued to open fire on the men holding the battering ram, but as quickly as they fell, more soldiers appeared to take their place. Fewer mines were going off, and Sam realized they must be running dangerously low. Try as he might, he wasn't able to fully douse the flames. What was more, he stomped down on the fire so hard that he felt a stab of pain rip through his kneecap. This wasn't good. The battering ram reached the gate, which had already been pelted with multiple Molotov cocktails. The fire had weakened the structure enough to the point where the first strike with the massive tree trunk shook the entire wall. The interior of the gate was braced with wooden planks, pressed against it at an angle. But even they were starting to bend and crack as the tree trunk slammed into the gate again and again. It was just a matter of time now. The flames had spread along the wall to such an extent they could no longer be ignored, and Sam noticed that Joe had suddenly stopped firing. He grimaced through the firelight and looked around, his eyes growing wide as panic started to set in. This really wasn't good. "Abandon the wall," Sam screamed down to the sentries. "Fall back and take secondary positions." He looked at Joe through the smoke and gave him a reassuring nod. "You got this, man?" he asked. And Joe's face scrunched up in frustration. He gave Sam a sharp nod. "Yeah, I'm right behind you," he said. "Eric, time to go," Sam called out to his son, who was still firing down at the soldiers as they advanced. "I can take more of them," he insisted. But Sam reached out to grab him by the bicep until the young man looked over at him. "The wall is lost," Sam said. "Fall back. Take them as they come through." He watched realization dawn over Eric's face, and soon Sam's son nodded in agreement and headed for the ladder. Sam was the next to follow him down and looked up at Joe, who recoiled as another Molotov cocktail slammed into the spiked fence to his right. "Come on, man," Sam called out to his friend. And Joe seemed to snap out of his panic and move toward the ladder, following the father and son team down. Sam nearly lost his grip on the ladder as the battering ram slammed into the door once more. "Fuck!" Joe exclaimed from above, his foot slipping, though he managed to keep himself from plummeting off the ladder to the ground. Joe's momentary slip, however, startled Sam, and he missed a rung on his way down, falling nearly halfway before crashing onto the grass at the base of the ladder. "Dad!" Eric cried out, rushing to Sam's side. "Sam!" Joe exclaimed, dropping off the ladder and landing on his feet. "Shit!" Sam muttered, clutching at his knee, which was practically exploding in agony. Joe and Eric struggled to lift him, and once he was vertical again, Sam pushed the two of them away, standing on his own while favoring his uninjured leg. "I'm good," he said to them. "Fall back before—" As soon as the words left Sam's mouth, the flaming gate splintered open after another powerful slam from the battering ram. "Go!" Sam screamed, motioning toward the trenches. Most of the sentries were already there, and Sam trailed behind his son and best friend, limping all the way as another powerful heave from the battering ram reduced the gate and its braces to splinters. A great cheer rose up from the cartel army as they started to pour through the wall, guns blazing as they targeted anyone in sight. Sam could feel bullets whizzing by his head as he watched Joe and Eric drop into the trench. Sam fell to one side and rolled, dropping into the trench just a fraction of a second before a score of bullets slammed into the space where he'd been. "Dad!" Eric cried out as the farm residents in the trenches opened fire on the gate, cutting down the soldiers who poured through. "I'm all right," Sam responded, clinging to the side of the trench as he pulled himself back up. He looked out at the flaming wall and the splintered entryway. The cartel soldiers were climbing over one another to rush in, and were getting instantly mowed down as soon as they emerged. To Sam, it looked like demons pouring out of the mouth of hell at the end of days, and the morbid pile of bodies starting to accumulate only served to make an already unsettling scene look even more vile. But this was all part of the plan, and Sam steadied himself, aiming his own rifle at the gate and opening fire alongside Joe and Eric. The corpses piled up had been accounted for, and Sam believed it would serve as a natural barrier that would hinder their ability to enter quickly. "We're holding them," Eric called out in triumph. But Sam knew this was only temporary, and that this battle was far from over. Chapter 35. Sitting beside the lake on the back of 20 acres, Carolyn could hear the sounds of gunfire in the distance. It turned her stomach to imagine her husband and son out there in the thick of it. She thought about what she might do in the event that both of them fell before Roja's advance. Every time she considered life without either or both of them, her mind could only come up with a blank nothingness. Their family was a unit, a powerful entity in its own right, and they all needed one another to carry on. But Carolyn knew what needed to be done, and she stood at the ready, listening for sounds of an approach. They were to wait here for 3 hours once the first shot sounded, and if no one from the farm came to meet up with them, they were to flee the area through a secret emergency exit in the back wall. But would she do it? Could she just leave without knowing what happened, without knowing if she'd ever see her family again? Carolyn took a look at the people who sat in the makeshift campsite with her. Many of them were elderly, and some were sick or frail, A lot of them were children with their whole lives ahead of them, who might very well lose their parents to this senseless grudge upheld by Julio Roja. Carolyn knew in that moment that she needed to stick to her promise. She needed to get these people to safety if the tide of the battle didn't turn in their favor. She wasn't going to like it, but it was what absolutely needed to be done. The sound of gunfire had sucked away any and all conversation among the gathered non-combatants, and many of the children were now crying and seeking comfort and reassurance from the adults who surrounded them. Carolyn winced at the sound of each gunshot, wondering if that was the fateful bullet that would take Eric or Sam from her forever. "Mrs. Shields," a male voice called out to her. She turned her head to look over at Jerry, the young man who had been injured by the cartel, who had first warned them of this threat. "Hey, Jerry," she said, crouching over the young man to look over his bandages. "How are you feeling?" "Hanging in there," Jerry replied, wincing in pain as he tried to sit up. "You just looked kind of lost in thought, and I was wondering if you needed to talk or something." Carolyn exhaled deeply and realized that she probably did need to talk, vent, get her feelings off her chest, and have a good cry about the stress and fear eating away at her heart and soul. But then she felt the weight of the weapon holstered at her side and realized she couldn't focus on herself right now. She had a job to do. She was in charge of protecting these people, and she couldn't do that while lost in a cloud of her own emotions. "That's sweet of you, Jerry," she said, giving him the warmest smile she could muster given the circumstances. "But I'll be all right." "Okay," he said, trying to return her smile with one of his own. "I just wish I was out there. I feel so helpless all the way out here, so far away from it all." "Yeah, kid," Carolyn said, as a fresh barrage of gunfire drew her attention and dread. "Me too." Chapter 36. Julio was still hanging back, allowing the fight to play out, allowing Shields to expose his hand and get all of his dangerous trips out of the way before he'd stride into the battlefield. "You ready to charge?" one of his men asked, seemingly itching to storm in and do battle against the cowardly wretches who made this farm their home. But Julio was in no rush. He simply shook his head slowly, pulling one of his uncle's last cigars out of his pocket and using a cigar cutter to slice off the tip. "Not yet," he replied, putting the cigar to his lips, lighting it, and taking a big puff. The smell reminded him of his uncle, of the cloud of smoke that had always surrounded him. It brought Julio comfort in this moment of triumph, as if the old man was still standing here beside him. "These filthy putas," the soldier remarked beside him, looking out in the direction of the farm. "A freaking minefield and traps. What kind of man fights like that?" "A smart one," Julio replied. "A capable fighter who has proven himself time and time again to be a worthy adversary." "You're right," the soldier replied with a shrug, daring to speak more to Julio in the last few minutes than any of his subordinates had chosen to in years. "I just don't feel right hanging back here while our boys are dying." "Relax," Julio said, taking another long, slow puff on his cigar. "We'll go in when the time is right. In chess, the pawns go first." He watched the soldier contemplate these words. He saw him turn their meaning over in his head slowly, until he realized that he wasn't one of those disposable pawns. This seemed to bring a moment of clarity and relief to his face, and he even gave a small half-smile. "That's deep, Jefe," he said. "Was that something your uncle used to say too?" "No, that was another wise man," Julio said. In actuality, that was a line spoken by the mutant supervillain Magneto in the movie X3, The Last Stand. But that wasn't something this grunt needed to know. Nor did he need to be told that he would be nothing more than a meat shield for Julio as they made their way through the gates. "Our time is coming," he said, taking another relaxing drag of the cigar. He had one more in his pants pocket, protected in a plastic case. He'd light it up over the body of Sam Shields and his murderous son. Maybe he'd even put it out in one of Shields' eyes. That would be some true justice. Let Shields play his games. Let him pretend to be some great general throwing foolish plan after foolish plan at his soldiers again and again. Once he was all out of tricks, Julio would arrive on the battlefield and put an end to him once and for all. He watched as plumes of smoke rose from the direction of the farm. He blew a cloud of smoke from between his lips, mirroring the smoke on the horizon. It was almost time. Chapter 37. Eric ducked back down into the trench to reload. He'd swapped out his submachine gun for a much larger and heavier automatic rifle that one of the other farm residents had tossed to him. He had handled these weapons before and understood their balance and recoil. It took him only a moment to get used to the switch, and he popped back up to gun down a few more cartel soldiers, who climbed over the bodies piling up in the entryway. They were starting to break through, and as more of them avoided the onslaught that had thinned their ranks, they drew fire away from the gates and allowed even more of their fellows access to the farm. "This was never a permanent solution," Sam said to him, firing off his own weapon. "All of this is just meant to thin them out and slow them down." "Right, I gotcha," Eric said. "We gotta just keep picking them off one at a time," Sam replied. "Superior positioning over manpower." "Kill 'em with bug bites," Uncle Joe said with a grin. He seemed to have recovered from his momentary panic on the wall, and he was once more a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. "What do we do when they keep breaking through then?" Eric asked, unable to keep his growing anxiety down. They'd thinned the herd considerably, but they just kept coming. "I have another big surprise for them," Sam said, and seemed as though he was about to continue explaining the next leg of this plan. However, they were interrupted as a small projectile the size of a rock landed in the trench between them. "Grenade!" Joe screamed, and all three of them jumped out of the trench. The explosive detonated a second later, and the concussive force of it slammed into Eric and sent him rolling across the ground. He heard the sound of similar explosions going off as the cartel soldiers advanced, blowing them out of their trenches and pursuing them as they fled with guns blazing. Eric looked out in horror as men and women he'd come to know and care for from around the farm were cut down before his eyes. "Fall back!" Sam screamed out over the battlefield. "Fall back to the barns!" Eric knew the barns were the next position, where they'd have some cover, but getting there was going to be hellacious. The farm's fighters took off running toward the barns, with cartel soldiers giving chase, mowing many of them down as they tried to flee. His father and uncle had vanished in the crowd, and Eric's eyes scanned around for them. He was concerned for his father now. His knee had given out on him, and he was in no condition to run. But the fact that Eric never saw the old man in his own frenzied flight from the scene seemed to indicate that his father was doing just fine. Eric and the other farm soldiers took up position behind large wooden barriers, erected around the barn, covered in razor wire. There was still no sign of his father, but Eric was in the thick of combat now, and couldn't be so concerned with the whereabouts of others. The moment he took his mind off the battle in front of him was the moment a bullet would find him. As the cartel soldiers advanced, despite taking some casualties, Eric was once more struck by their sheer numbers. They had killed so many, and even now more were coming. Then a sudden flash of sustained light from behind him, and a sound that no one on the battlefield had expected to hear, ripped through the area. It was the sound of a revving engine. Eric watched in amazement as his father's armored pickup truck burst out of the barn, Joe driving it as it raced ahead and plowed into the cartel soldiers. In the back, crouched in the truck's bed, was his father, at the controls of a mounted M134 minigun, which spat bullets from a rotating barrel at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. "All right!" Eric exclaimed in joy, as many of the other soldiers on his side whooped and hollered in triumph, as cartel members fell either under the bumper and tires of the truck, or from the molten death that spewed forth from the minigun. They were driving them back, literally. This could work. They might actually have a shot here. Chapter 38. Sam braced himself in the bed of the truck as Joe took another sharp turn. The bullets of the cartel soldiers bounced harmlessly off the bulletproof glass and armor plating of old Bertha, as it mowed them down like wheat in the field. However, Sam was completely exposed to their fire. He made up for it by turning the rear of the truck into a fountain of death, so terrifying to these enemy combatants that they never even had a chance to get a shot off at him. The minigun was another special acquisition that had remained protected within the Faraday cage for such an occasion, and it was useful in turning the tide of battle. Sam shifted his attention back over his shoulder toward the flaming gate, and something instantly caught his attention. It was Roja, striding onto the battlefield, with some kind of heavy weapon in his hands. Sam reached back and banged on the back window of the truck with the palm of his hand. Joe glanced back and saw where Sam was pointing. He gave a thumbs up and shifted course, driving right for the cartel's #1 man. Sam ensured that no one was firing from behind, fending off the cartel's men with the minigun. He looked back just in time to see Julio raise his weapon and fire it at the truck. A projectile flew from the wide barrel, and Sam instantly recognized what Roja was holding: a grenade launcher. Just before the explosive slammed into the front of the truck, Sam jumped out of the bed, landing hard on the ground and feeling his knee reward him with a massive stab of pain that echoed throughout his entire body, as his rolling landing bludgeoned and lacerated his body. A massive explosion erupted across Bertha's grill, and the car spun out of control. Another round from Julio's weapon slammed into the side of the car, and the vehicle, with Joe still inside. It rolled uncontrollably end over end until it stopped completely upside down. Roja fired again, striking the underside of the vehicle, igniting the fuel tank. Sam watched in horror as the car exploded into a massive fireball. He screamed in anguish, watching the flaming mess that undoubtedly claimed the life of his friend and brother. "No!" Sam cried out, drawing Julio's attention. "Shields!" he screamed, his face a twisted mask of rage. Julio pointed the grenade launcher at Sam and took aim. Sam could barely move, and time seemed to stand still. But right before Julio was about to pull the trigger, the sound of gunfire erupted from behind Sam, and Roja ducked behind 3 of the men who were flanking him. The soldiers ate the gunfire, and Sam looked back to see Eric running toward him. The battle was still going back near the barn, and Sam and Joe's combined attack had managed to thin out the enemy ranks enough to give the farm soldiers a fighting chance. But still, Eric was needed back there, helping the rest of the community, not risking his life trying to save his father from this demented maniac. "There you are," Rojas said, as his men fell dead. He fired off a grenade in Eric's direction, but it hit the ground in front of the young man and it tossed him back and away from Sam. "Don't worry, Shields," Rojas said, gesturing back to the battle that continued to rage behind them. "My men know better than to interfere in this. I want you all to myself." "Well, you got us," Eric exclaimed, jumping out of cover and firing at Rojas with his automatic rifle. Rojas took off running, diving behind the flaming remains of the truck to take cover. Eric looked haggard and spent. He barely had enough strength to hold his rifle. Sam struggled to stand. He had to join the fight, had to help his son stand against this enemy. Eric was firing blindly now, letting his fear and hate take control of his common sense. Sam tried to call out to his son, tried to warn him that he needed to stop. But soon, the click of an empty weapon could be heard. And Rojas jumped out, aiming at Eric with a small handgun. He had the young man dead to rights, and there was no escape. Just then, a massive figure dove out from the front of the car, plowing into Rojas and taking him off his feet. It was Joe. He was alive. He was burned badly, and his clothes were singed. But he was alive and upright and grimacing in the face of his flame-related PTSD. "You!" Rojas screamed, fumbling around for his handgun, which he dropped as he fell. "Yeah, nice try, Dick." Joe spat blood that welled up from within him somewhere and limped toward Rojas with murderous intent. "Kid," he called back to Eric, "get your old man and get out of here. Fall back to the place." The place was their code for the non-combatant lake. If all seemed lost, they could reconvene with Carolyn there and escape together, but only if the cartel couldn't follow. "What about you?" Eric asked, practically ready to fall over with exhaustion. "I got this," Joe said, putting himself between Rojas and the shield's men. "I mean it, go." "Joe!" Sam screamed from the ground, trying to get back to a standing position. "I'll be right behind you," Joe said, "after I clean up this garbage." Sam felt Eric's arms wrap around his waist and start to pull him away. "No!" Sam screamed, reaching for Joe as if he had the power to pull the big man along with them. His friend was busted up bad from the crash and explosion. He was burned and beaten. And Rojas was mostly fresh. He wouldn't stand a chance. "Joe, stop!" "I love you, brother," he called out over his shoulder. Then he rushed in to attack. Chapter 39. "Oh, no, you don't," Rojas exclaimed, trying to move around Joe to give chase to Eric and Sam. But Joe blocked him with the skill of an expert lineman, plowing into the drug lord and tossing him back. Rojas rolled away from him and came up to his feet next to the body of one of his soldiers. "I heard about you, Joseph," he said, sneering through a bloody nose at the big man. Joe could barely see straight as he blinked through a trickle of blood that ran over his eye. Every bone in his body hurt, and something inside him was seriously wrong. He continued to swallow swells of blood that rose up from within his chest, trying to keep it all down as he faced down this enemy. "I'm flattered," Joe said, trying to suppress a bloody cough that ripped its way out of his lungs. "Yeah, Jacob talked about you a lot," Julio said, a smile coming over his face. "It's amazing how everything just pours out of someone's mouth after you break them. They have no friends anymore, no family. They start to tell you secrets about anyone you ask about. You're going to pay for what you did to him, you sick fuck," Joe spat, his anger rising until it made his hands shake. "No, I'm going to put you down like the dog you are," And then I'm gonna make your friends over there suffer, Rojas said, with a smile, as if he knew something Joe did not. He reached down to the body of his fallen soldier and pulled something up. Joe ran forward, determined to stop him from grabbing a weapon. Julio pulled up a Molotov cocktail, lighting it with a lighter he pulled from his pocket, and hurled it at Joe. Joe tried to jump back, but the bottle exploded on his leg. The fire started to spread along his pants, and in spite of himself, Joe screamed in horror. He dropped to the ground and started rolling, his panic and adrenaline eating the pain coursing from his injuries. "That's right, pendejo," Julio said. "Feel the burn. Did you know a lot of people here know about your little post-traumatic stress? It's kind of pathetic when you think about it. Your failures overseas following you here, and now you're failing again. Your friends are going to die just like your fellow soldiers did." Joe managed to douse enough of the flames to tear away the pant leg before the blaze could spread. His leg was red and raw with burns, and the fire spread along the dried-out grass in front of him. Joe scooted back away from it, his eyes wide and his breathing ragged. He spat huge mouthfuls of blood as he rolled back, looking up at Rojas as he smiled down at him in genuine amusement. "Sorry, Joseph," Julio said, reaching down to pull a pistol off of one of his soldiers. "I would have loved to fight you one-on-one at full strength. I think it would have been an interesting matchup, but I've got a date with your friend and his son, and I can't miss it." Joe cringed as Julio's words filtered into his panicked mind. The flames in front of him were only growing as he backed up against the smoldering remains of the truck. There was now a growing wall of fire between him and Rojas, but not much distance. He pointed the pistol at Joe and smiled as he pulled the trigger, only to be met with a hollow click. It was empty. Rojas grimaced in frustration and reached down to pull ammunition from the soldier's body. Joe had time now. He could rush out and try to get the gun from Rojas, then wrestle him to the ground and finish him off once and for all. But he couldn't move. His body was injured, but still capable. It was his mind that froze him in place. He thought of that dark day in Iraq, the way the flames engulfed his brothers in arms, chewing them to nothingness as he lay there wounded. It was happening again. He was failing the people he loved in the same way, all because he was too weak to overcome his own trauma, too powerless against the weight of his horrible memories. "No," Joe growled, thinking back to all the moments he'd spent standing side by side with Sam Shields. Their happy days as kids, riding bikes and collecting baseball cards. The day he stood beside him as his best man when Sam had married Carolyn. The day he first held Eric in his arms, just hours after the little tyke had come into the world. He thought of how they'd worked together on the farm, how they'd stormed the city together, fought together, and backed each other up through their hardest moments. Joe wasn't going to just give up. Not on Eric, not on Sam, and not on himself. He gritted his teeth and willed his body to move, overcoming the temporary paralysis his mind had inflicted on him, and diving through the blaze at Rojas, just as he finished loading the gun. Julio looked alarmed and pointed the gun at Joe, firing it just as the big man reached him. Joe managed to grab Julio by the wrist and throw off his aim. What could have been a fatal gut shot instead grazed his ribs. Joe grunted in pain and lashed out with his free hand, striking Rojas in the eye patch and forcing the drug lord to scream in agony. Joe gripped Julio's captured wrist and drove his knee up into the elbow of that arm. Julio screamed as a terrifying crunch rose from his throat. He tried to jump back as the gun dropped from his limp fingers, but Joe pulled him close and drove a knee into his solar plexus. Roja doubled over and lashed out with his free hand, fingers like claws, as he raked at Joe's face. His nails drew blood, but the true damage came when his thumb pressed into Joe's eye, bursting the tissue there, which sent fresh pain across his face and darkness over half of Joe's vision. But still, Joe didn't let go. He went for the other eye, poking with his thumb, but he found Joe's mouth instead. Joe allowed the thumb to pass between his lips and bit down through flesh and bone until his teeth met one another. Roja screeched in agony as his thumb fell off in Joe's mouth, and the big man spat it out onto the grass in contempt. Julio threw himself back, his shattered arm falling out of Joe's grip as he landed on the grass right next to his gun. Roja closed his fingers of his broken hand around the handle and braced his wrist with his thumbless hand as he aimed at Joe's broad torso. Joe ran in to finish the drug lord off, just as he pulled the trigger. The shot struck him in the chest on the right side, and Joe instantly felt his legs turn to jelly. He gasped as he started to fall back, but righted his momentum until he collapsed to his knees, breathing in bloody, rasping gasps as Roja stood to his full height. "Piece of shit!" he screamed, his face contorted in crimson rage. "You nobody! Nothing, motherfucker! I'll fucking show you!" He pointed the gun at Joe once more, bracing his dangling arm with his mangled hand. But Joe summoned every ounce of resilience he had to rise once more, coming up to his feet. He knocked the gun aside with one hand, his one-eyed face twisted in determination as he slammed a meaty fist into Roja's chest. Julio fell back, collapsing to the ground. Joe took a pained, lumbering step toward him. But Roja recovered quickly, raising the gun with his makeshift grip and firing 2 more shots that struck Joe in the chest and stomach. Joe crumpled again onto his side, blood now pouring from his lips onto the ground as his heart began to slow. He landed on his hip and braced himself with one arm, while Roja climbed to his feet again. The drug lord's single eye was wide with shock now as he looked at this man, this epic warrior, whose life was bleeding out before his eyes. "You," Roja said, his breath washing out in a pained sigh. "You've earned a warrior's death and my respect." He took a step toward Joe, ready to finish him off. But Joe screamed in agony and drive, pushing himself up to one knee and striking up with his fist, catching Roja in the chin. Julio flew back with the force of the blow, flying off his feet before crashing back down to the grass on his back. Joe rose with the momentum, the gaping bullet wounds in his torso tearing open all the more as he moved. He took another labored step toward Roja, but the drug lord turned the gun on him again from the ground, firing off 3 more rounds that all connected with Joe's torso. He fell to his knees once more, but didn't fall. Joe swayed to and fro, his vision blurring in and out as he fought for each remaining breath. Roja sat up, mere feet from him, and the 2 of them just stared at one another, single eye to single eye. Julio nodded to him, a grim smile of respect on his face. But Joe didn't need this monster's respect. He only hoped that what he'd done here was enough to buy Sam and Eric the time they needed to get to safety. Roja raised the gun once more, level with Joe's head. He pulled the trigger, and Joe let go, drifting off into eternal shadows. Chapter 40. The sounds of battle were slowing, but the soldiers of the farm were still battling the cartel. Sam knew the cartel's numbers had dwindled now more than enough to even the playing field. Eric shook beside him, bearing his father's weight as they limped along together toward the old tractor barn, which had gone mostly unused since the EMP had rendered all motorized farming equipment useless. "Let's stop in here, Dad," Eric said, pulling Sam along into the barn, which was open at both sides. There were 2 lit kerosene lanterns within the barn, left by Carolyn and the rest of the non-combatants who had come through here on their way to the lake. Eric grabbed one of the lanterns and used it to light the interior of the barn. He dragged his father along the hay-covered floor. "I need to stop for a second." "All right," Sam said, leaning up against one of the disabled tractors, while Eric walked a few paces away toward the back exit of the barn. Sam's eyes traveled back toward the barn's entrance, and he listened intently for signs of battle. "I should be out there with them," Sam said. "They're fighting without us now." "There's nothing you can do, Dad," Eric replied, shaking his head. "It's in their hands now." Sam cursed his weakness. His son was right, but Sam still wished he could sprint out of here and run to where they'd left Joe, to stand with him against Roja, and then charge together side by side into the fray, as they'd always done. But the reality of the situation couldn't be denied. He was badly hurt. He'd be a liability out there. He had to retreat and trust those they'd left behind to finish the job. "Can you take this?" Eric said, handing the lantern off to Sam, who took it in one hand. Sam nodded as Eric walked over behind the tractor. He could hear the young man retching and the sound of wet vomit erupting from his throat and hitting the ground. "You all right, kiddo?" Sam called back, his voice weary. "I'm just exhausted," Eric said. "I'll be fine." "I don't know about that," a haggard and exhausted voice called out from the entrance of the barn. Both Sam and Eric turned to see the silhouetted body of Julio Roja, hunched like a zombie in front of them. Blood spilled from his face onto the floor. One arm dangled at his side, swaying unnaturally. Blood poured from his other hand, which he had braced against his torso. Sam thought it looked as though he was missing a finger, perhaps a thumb. "Shit," Eric said. But Sam stumbled away from the tractor, holding the lantern up and standing as strong as he could between Eric and Roja. "Where's Joe?" Sam asked. But he was already positive he knew the answer. "Your friend," Roja said, panting with pain and exhaustion. "He fought well." Sam felt a stab of pain in his heart, and he had to swallow a sob that wanted to push out of his chest with the power to shake the world. "You'll," Sam said, his voice shaking as he sniffled and tears poured down his cheeks to mix with blood. "You'll die for that." "No," Rojas said, reaching out with his thumbless hand to grab the lantern. He held it up to properly look at the 2 shieldsmen. "You're already dead, old man." He tried to laugh, but it made him cough, and Sam watched with some satisfaction as blood pushed its way through his grill, leaving flecks of red along the silver. "Dad," Eric said, coming back around the tractor. "No," Sam said, his voice commanding and final. "You go find your mother. I've got this." "Like hell," Eric said, ignoring his father's authority. But Sam threw the lantern down on the hay-covered ground at Eric's feet. He jumped back as the kerosene spilled out, and the fire quickly spread into a wall that kept him and his father apart. But this wall would soon continue through the barn, becoming an inescapable inferno. Sam knew this, and he accepted it. "What are you doing?" Eric screamed. "Find your mother," Sam spat back at him. Tell her I love you both." Julio chuckled and coughed at that, Yeah, boy, go find your mama, he said, tossing his own lantern back to block off entry from the other side. I'll come find you both when I'm done with Pappy here. Dad, Eric called out over the chewing flames. Go, son, Sam replied. Go now. There was a silence for a long moment as the fires on both sides of the barn spread up the walls. I love you, Dad, Eric said. And Sam heard the sound of his son turning to run toward safety. At least he'd done something right. So, Rojas said, taking a step farther into the room as the flames spread behind him. It was then that Sam noticed the gun he clutched in his dangling arm. Here we are. Here we are, Sam echoed. Are you so desperate to get your revenge that you doom yourself? Sam pointed back toward the other side of the barn, where Rojas had cut off his only means of escape. Oh, that, Rojas smiled at him. I'm not worried about that. This isn't going to take me long, and a few burns aren't going to kill me. No, Sam replied, shaking his head at this maniac's psychotic mindset. I am. Well then, let's go, Shields, he said. Let's see what you got. Julio reached over with his mangled hand to grab the wrist of his other hand. He started to lift his broken arm, and with it the gun. Sam reached down and grabbed an old steel bucket that was still beside one of the tractors and heaved it at Rojas. It struck him in the head, which slowed his draw. Rojas raised the gun, just a fraction too slow, and fired. But Sam had already thrown himself off to the side. Rojas turned and aimed the gun again, pulling the trigger. But it clicked ineffectually in response. Ha! Sam barked with a cough as he braced himself against the front of the tractor. You had one shot and you blew it, Rojas. I don't care, the drug lord spat, dropping the gun and letting his arm dangle. This should be done hand to hand anyway. I agree, Sam said, limping forward with both hands up, ready to duke it out. Rojas moved steadily on both his legs, but he was only able to lift one arm as they circled one another. It was Julio who made the first move, kicking out at Sam's injured leg. Sam wasn't able to jump back in time, and Julio's strike landed. Sam howled in pain and dropped to the ground, but managed to reach out with one hand and grab Julio by the shattered arm, yanking it down with him and causing his nemesis to scream in agony. The two of them toppled to the floor together as the fire continued to spread. Chunks of flaming wooden debris started to fall from the ceiling, crashing around them, as Sam rose to his good knee and slammed his fist into the side of Julio's face. Rojas was now up to both knees and struck out with his bleeding hand, cracking Sam in the sternum with all of his weight and momentum behind him. Sam reeled back, catching himself with one hand as he struggled to draw breath. He coughed as the air he managed to pull into his lungs was laced with smoke. He reached out and grabbed Julio by the back of the head, pulling him forward and bashing his head into the drug lord's face. Julio recoiled and nearly fell. He started coughing as he inhaled gulping gasps of smoky oxygen. Rojas' eye met the same eyes, and the two of them started to wildly flail at one another, striking out with fists and elbows, screaming and clawing at each other in a wild, whirling hurricane of hate. Their screams were deep bellows of anger and pain, each thinking of those they'd lost in service of this grudge. Finally, Julio managed to wrap his good arm around Sam's neck, trying to choke the life from him. But before his windpipe closed fully, Sam reached up and grabbed Rojas by the back of his hair, pulling back and exposing his throat. Sam's massive, powerful free hand flew up and closed itself around Julio's neck. They both gasped and squeezed together, no longer able to make a sound or pull in a single breath. That was when the flaming ceiling collapsed. Chapter 41. Eric saw the lake approaching, and he could see a blurry mass in front of it that must have been people. "Who's there?" The unmistakable voice of his mother called out, and he imagined her standing out in front of everyone, hand resting on her weapon. "Ma," he managed to mutter, emerging into the clearing and affixing his mother in his sights. "Eric!" she called out, running to her boy and flinging her arms around him. Eric enjoyed the peace of the moment, for there had been moments in the heat of combat where he worried he might never enjoy the embrace of his mother ever again. So he reveled in her nearness, her warmth, and the unconditional love that she'd always shown him. Carolyn kissed her son on the side of the head and pulled away from him. Eric noticed that the rest of the non-combatants were starting to gather around them, eager to hear what was being said, desperate for any news from the battlefield. Eric noticed that the sounds of battle seemed far off and fading, as though the conflict might be drawing to a close. "Where's your father?" Carolyn asked. "What's going on out there?" Eric looked over his mother's shoulder and saw Jerry, leaning against a large rock by the bank of the lake, straining to see his friend and hear what they had to say. Eric looked out over them all and cleared his throat. He summoned all of his remaining strength and recounted the battle for them. He spoke of the minefield, the machine guns, the flaming wall, and the trench warfare. He told the story of his father and Joe, and how they'd turned the tip of battle by riding out in the armored truck with the minigun mounted to its bed. He then talked of Joe's sacrifice, how he'd bought them time to get out of there, and how Roja had tracked them down. "Dad told me to find you," Eric said. His eyes filled with sorrow and a desperate longing to understand the unknown. "But as for where he is or what's happening out there right now, I don't know any more than you guys do." After recounting the tale, Eric was led to the side of the lake, where he practically collapsed beside Jerry, and continued to wait with the rest of the camp for any news. A few times he considered running back out there, trying to figure out what became of his father or the others. Did the cartel now control the farm, or had they turned that overwhelming enemy force away? And what had happened between his father and Roja? Had either of them walked away from that flaming encounter? Had they burned to death together, locked in combat until the very end? Eric was taken from his thoughts nearly an hour later, as the time limit imposed on the group by Sam prior to the battle was drawing to a close. They were mere minutes away from having to abandon the farm, according to Carolyn, and that thought broke Eric's heart. But then a rustling came from the trees, and Eric sat up, wondering if the cartel had won the day, and chased them down to finish the job and make good on Julio's promise of death. But it wasn't the cartel. It was the remaining fighters of the farm community, limping their way out of the trees and approaching the group with proud faces. They were bloody and dirty, and there were far fewer now than there had been at the start of the operation. But they were alive, and they were here, and that could only mean one thing. Rebecca, one of the veteran farmhands who had fought on the wall alongside him and his father, stepped forward, a proud but sad smile on her face. "We won," she said. "The last of the cartel fled through the wall nearly 40 minutes ago." A great cheer rose up from the group, and Eric felt tears streaming down his face. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. They'd turned back a massive enemy force and protected their home, their dream of a better tomorrow. "There's a lot still to do," Dr. Jeffries said, walking out from the group of soldiers. He'd been on the field as well, serving as a combat medic. And we lost a lot of people, but we won. Another huge cheer rang out, and the non-combatants ran forward, wading through the sea of soldiers in an attempt to find their loved ones and friends. There were happy cries of relief and anguished sobs as they began to discover who had lived and who had died. But Eric and Carolyn stayed behind with Jerry. Carolyn stood beside Eric as he climbed back to his feet. While it was heartwarming to see these reunions taking place, along with the palpable relief of a victorious community, there was still no sign of Sam. Had he given his all for the people of the farm? Had he given his life to ensure that Roja couldn't hurt them any longer? "Hey, Rebecca," Eric called out as the young woman passed by. She looked at him, head tilted, waiting for him to speak. "My dad, is he—" "Alive and well," a very familiar voice called out from the crowd. Eric and Carolyn's faces snapped to the sound of the voice, and Eric found himself gasping in shock as two men emerged from the sea of people carrying Sam, who limped between them. "Dad!" Eric screamed. "Sam!" Carolyn cried out in shock. The two of them rushed Sam, who was covered in bruises, lacerations, and deep burns. They slammed into him, hugging him desperately as he coughed and groaned at their strength. "Easy," he said. "I'm all right. A little worse for wear and a little extra crispy, but I made it." "What about Roja?" Eric asked, his stomach tight. "He's gone, son," Sam said. "We're safe now. He's nothing more than a burned-out corpse laying under what used to be our tractor barn." Carolyn cried out in relief, pressing her forehead into the side of her husband's head. Eric hugged his two parents together. They had made it. They were alive. But there were still many big losses to mourn. Epilogue. 4 weeks later, the last of the cleanup from the battle was nearly complete. Sam stood alone outside the empty cabin that had once served as the home of his best friend and brother, leaning heavily on a cane that the doctor believed might become a permanent fixture in his life. He looked down at a polished gravestone, one of the many the community had come together to make in the wake of the battle. They'd lost over half of their fighters, which was nearly half of the entire community, and there were daily memorial services to honor their fallen heroes. But one hero stood above them all for Sam, and there was not a day that had passed where he hadn't wept bitterly at the loss he felt, eating away at his heart. "Oh, man," Sam said, sniffling and letting out a sob as he wiped tears from his eyes with the back of his hand. "You really got the last word this time, didn't you?" He chuckled at that, hoping that somewhere out there, Joe was satisfied. I know I keep coming out here and I keep saying the same shit over and over again, but I miss you, brother. You are a part of me, and without you, it feels like I'll never be whole again. And I can never repay you for what you've done, not just for me, but for my family." Sam sniffled again, feeling the weight of grief pulling down his heart, covering him with a fog of depression and despair. He'd give anything to hear his friend's voice again, anything to be annoyed by him again. He knew if Joe were here, he'd give him a pep talk about picking himself back up. He'd tell him that he had a lot to live for, and not to waste the life that Joe had saved. "You went out the way you were always gonna, man," Sam said, his voice breaking. You went out a hero. You went out my hero. But you were my hero long before that day. And I wanted to do something to, I guess, honor that. Honor the sacrifice you made for my boy and for me. Well, you know, how I once told you I'd never give this farm a name. How I thought it was corny to name a piece of property. Well, I went back on that today. Right outside the wall, there's a sign that anyone who approaches can see plain as day. Sam sighed as his shoulders shook. He waited a moment until he was properly composed to continue. It says, "Welcome to Johan," Sam said with a laugh that turned into a sob. He wiped away tears again, his lips quivering as he looked down at the gravestone. "Thank you. I know it's not enough to just say it, but thank you. I love you, my brother." Sam wiped away another tear from his fingers, and then brought the same hand down to touch the front of the headstone that marked Joe's final resting place. It said, "Joseph Connor Blaine, beloved friend, brother, and uncle. For he was a gentle and great king, and he kept his oaths. And he rose out of the shadows to a last fair morning. J.R.R. Tolkien."